There's lots of stories about you, of course.
I'm getting tired of me. Are you
I know,
tired of me?
I'm not tired of you because I keep learning about you. So we're talking travel and all the places you've been. Yeah. Could you even go down the list? Try. Let's go.
Boy, it'd be really hard. But just because I was lucky enough at my previous job in Oklahoma City, they believed in sending me all over the place too.
You came to when you came to WDIV, you knew the importance of obviously local TV, but we also need to branch out and show how the world also affects us locally.
Well, in fact, that's one of the things that I really believe in when I talk about you and I talk about local news coverage. It doesn't necessarily mean it's only happening here. It means viewing whatever happens anywhere in the world through our local sensibilities. And it just so turns out, as you know well, everything that happens in the world, somewhere there's a Detroit connection, which is just kind of wacky. But you know, when we go to the Olympics just now in Paris, well, how many Michiganders were we there following? I mean, it was a ton. And so that's what I think about when I'm a local news lens when we're traveling all over the world.
So let's talk about Olympics, and we
could
spend an hour.
Try and go down for you.
Well, let's do Olympics first. We could spend an hour, of course, but was there an Olympic game that really touched you, or a story, or an athlete moment?
There's a million of them but the first, I mean, I've always been a huge fan of the Olympics going back to when I was a little kid. I can remember the 1972 Munich Olympics, not just because of what happened with the Israeli athletes, but how the U.S. American basketball team was so robbed. And I was like 9 years old, and this is not fair.
Right.
And that stayed with me for a long, long time. But then I can think of so many Olympic moments. Franz Klammer in 1976, Bruce Jenner in 1976, the Miracle on Ice. The Olympics were always this mythic thing to me, and then I get to start covering them. And the first one that I got to go cover for Channel 4 was in Sydney in 2000.
Greetings from the future. It is already Thursday morning here in Sydney, off to a beautiful start.
And I was just so blown away at actually being at one. The experience of being around all these venues, all the athletes, all these people who've come from all over the world to support their teams. And I was absolutely really hooked from then, because I always say the Olympics never let you down.
No.
There's always going to be everything that a storyteller wants. There's going to be moments of glory and triumph. There's going to be moments of crushing disappointment. There's going to be somebody who comes out of nowhere to have this great Olympic moment. And of course, it's the Olympics, so there's going to be controversy as well. They never let you down. And so to have been able to go to 10 of them, I feel like I bookended the two best ones. Sydney was amazing for so many different reasons because it was my first. And Paris really was such a wonderful, almost restart of the Olympics that we've all come to know and love. And there were so many amazing stories and such an amazing city to host them. And so I feel like I got it just right.
You started it right and ended it with a...
That's right.
Let's talk about, I remember when I first met you, you had just gotten back from your trip to Russia.
Yeah.
And the stories from there. And I saw this old photograph, and I'll show it to you later, but the photograph had you and Tim Pamplin, Mike Lewis, Bob Ellis. And I was like, wow, what was that like? And why was it important to go?
You know, I have been lucky enough now, what a weird thing, but I've done 3 documentaries now in Russia, which I just would not have expected that to be so prominent in my passport. But I am so fascinated by Russia, Russian literature, Russian art, Russian history. But I grew up as a child of the Cold War. And so Russia always loomed so large as this, well, I guess you'd have to say an enemy in a certain way of thinking, but certainly an adversary. And then that spilled over into all the Olympic Games, and we would have these sort of surrogate nuclear wars going on between the U.S. and that's why the Miracle on Ice was such a momentous occasion. But
what was the big story when you went to Russia?
The first time that I went to Russia was when I was in Oklahoma City. Was the first winter of democracy in Russia. This one, we went over to follow the Stanley Cup when the Russian Five took the Stanley Cup over after that first big cup win. And to watch those Russian athletes who had always played, back when they played for the Russian Army team, they would always have their big moments celebrating Soviet Russia and Soviet hockey on Red Square. And here they were taking the symbol of Western hockey, the Stanley Cup, back, standing right in front of Lenin's tomb. It was unbelievable. I mean, you could just feel them all. They were all proud Russians, but they were all also kind of very happy to put a stake, you know, put that Western flag right there, and not only the way that they had overcome the Soviet system, but the way that they had then come over and helped overtake, you know, create a home for Russians in American hockey.
Why do you think those stories resonated for that local viewer, for Joe in Livonia, and he sees you go to Russia?
The Russian Five had such a different kind of hold on this city's imagination. No matter what you had thought of the Russians before, watching those five guys skate around on the ice, it was like watching some sort of a magic show. The puck just stayed on their stick, and it was mesmerizing. And if you know, then the legend of Vladimir Konstantinov, which ended so tragically, and yet he loomed so. I mean, how many Vladdy jerseys do you still see at Red Wing games? So there was the American fan base was very, I think, uniquely wrapped up in what happened in that moment, watching the cup.
I was going to say the Vatican. You went to Rome 3 times while working here at Local 4. Why do you think that was such an important story to tell and retell? Obviously, our audience.
The Catholic Church looms so large in America, but of course in Detroit. And it's been a huge part of Detroit's history. It's been a very Catholic city for so long. And I'm always fascinated by what happens in Rome and the way, you know, it's the opposite of Las Vegas. What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. What happens in Rome goes all over the world.
Never thought of it that way. All right.
And I did not grow up Catholic, but I'm always been fascinated by the Catholic Church, fascinated by the papacy, and the rich history and the culture of it has always been something that has just really taken hold of me. And to have been there now a couple of times to the point where I know my way around the Vatican press office.
It's pretty cool.
Crazy.
That's pretty cool to say.
Cool.
Right?
And that night, covering the last conclave, when Cardinal Bergoglio of Argentina walked out on the balcony, introduced as Pope Francis, and I'm standing there on St. Peter's Square, I could not believe that I was there for a moment like that. And Karen, I am the luckiest guy on the planet. I cannot believe the stuff that I've gotten to see and cover. It's just really, it's the coolest thing. We don't talk about it much as journalists, but the ticket that we get to be behind the velvet rope on so many things, the things that we get to see as history in the making, because that's our job, is writing that first draft of history. And to have been there for moments like that, I just can't believe my fortune.
Cuba. That was an interesting assignment.
Same thing. Another place that had loomed because of the Cold War. I had such a concept of what Cuba was. And that's one of the things that my travels have taught me. Almost every place I've ever been, not almost, every place I've ever been, I've had this set of preconceived notions, and they've been shattered by arriving there. I ended up finding such warm, friendly people on my trips to Russia, people that I really enjoyed talking to on my trips to China. And Cuba had always, been this place that just seemed so in black and white. I mean, it really seemed very removed from what Cuba once was. I get there and I find this vibrant culture of music and food and obviously under the thumb of communism, and yet a way that, this human spirit that finds a way to thrive in the darkest places sometimes. And of course, for a Detroiter, going back and finding all those cars still come to life.
I remember the video and it came back. They were so bright and alive. I was like, wow.
And it took such unbelievable ingenuity to keep them running.
Anyone with an old car will tell you they come with one big problem. They tend to break down. Well, if yours breaks down in Havana, we got a guy.
They can't get parts for a 1940 Plymouth. I mean, you're kidding?
Right?
And yet, here they are all still rolling around the streets of Havana. Unbelievable. Yeah.
Speaking of cars, obviously some of your travels took you to places to cover things for the big three.
Yeah.
What stands out to you in terms of some of those assignments?
It was funny when I remember being sent to Germany to cover the merger of Daimler and Chrysler. And at the time, it seemed so extreme and crazy. We hadn't seen anything like that. And now I've lost count of how many mergers we've seen in the auto world. But I do remember the idea. I was so fascinated by, everybody kept telling me about the business sense that merger was going to make. But I was really, I couldn't figure out if you could marry the cultures of the companies. A German company where everything was so, written down in notebooks and everything was so very, I mean, not to stereotype the German
very
business
concrete
culture,
and strict,
but very strict, very regimented. And, Chrysler has its meetings in the hallway around the water cooler. And at the end of all of it, they really couldn't quite mesh those two cultures very well. So I think my question at the time ended up being fairly prescient. But then that one, and then going to cover, going to China and finding out everything that I did about what was happening with electrification in the Chinese auto world. And
We're actually the first American TV station invited to visit the plant.
I remember seeing the first Geely automobile that China had turned out, their first mass production automobile, and you kind of looked at it and you thought, this is barely a golf cart. Well, now you look at, I mean, that was just
It had to start somewhere.
Had to start somewhere, and they caught up very, very quickly, and now the competition is on, and I've been completely fascinated by that too. The Chinese, another thing that because of the Cold War, I grew up with a certain understanding of what China was. Now, China is still communist, but not really. I mean, it is a full-blown, it is an open, well, not an open market, but a capitalist kind of version of communism. And those things didn't seem to go together. But Deng Xiaoping came out in the late 80s or early 90s and said, to get wealthy is a glorious thing. And so they've embraced this, market, the world market. And it has been an unbelievable story watching the way that China has developed even against this communist government that, again, now an adversary for the U.S. And those are the kind of things that will never cease to fascinate me.
When you take a look, I think everyone says, what's your favorite story? And people will be like, it's always like the last one you worked on or the one you pulled your heart on. But is there one that you have a lot of pride in? Maybe it was really challenging. Maybe there was something behind the scenes that made it different, or maybe something where you grew personally. But is there one that hits you?
I mean, of course, the most recent one, Paris, was amazing. 3 weeks in Paris in the summer. Pretty good, Karen. But yes, the one that, and they've all stayed with me in so many different ways. Korea was fascinating because we've watched the rise of Korea. In fact, that was the name of the documentary. It was Korea Rising. But the one I think that will stay with me and has stayed with me forever was right after Francis was named Pope. There seemed to be this change coming in the Catholic Church to some. And so I went to Italy and did a documentary called The Francis Factor. And really the question that was posed by the special was, can a faith change? Should a faith change to keep with the times? Because at the time, and there still is, this huge division between American Catholics and their European and South American and Central American counterparts. The fight over whether divorced people should be able to have communion. Should the church bend to that? Is that keeping up with the times? Or is a faith something that is absolute and concrete? And no, you don't move the faith. You move the faithful to the faith. I'm still completely fascinated. I have no idea what the answer is to that question. I know that the things that Pope Francis said, especially as in his first year of his papacy, when he said things like, communion is not a prize to be won, it is medicine for the sick. And watching Americans grow, American Catholics kind of believed that maybe there was this sort of shift coming. Well, it really didn't come, because as somebody described to me during that special, the Pope's message and the Pope's orders are only as successful as the bishop's willingness to take that back to their local churches.
Right.
And so those things didn't, Alan Vigneron here in Detroit kind of resisted that notion. And so that was a special that I am, I guess, reluctant, hesitant to say, didn't really, I don't know that it ever registered very much here. I was so proud of it, and I thought it was pondering such deep questions. And it's the thing that I'm still proudest of that I've ever put together. That was a far too long of an answer.
No, but I like it because I know, but I like it because it leaves you being the reporter. It leaves you asking questions.
Completely. And that's one of the things that I've been, you and I both believe this. The best anchors are good reporters.
Yeah.
People who, want to know how to get out from behind the anchor desk every once in a while. But my favorite part of journalism really is pondering really some of the biggest questions. And those, questions about faith and spirituality say so much about who we are as a people. And so I'm very, very proud of that documentary, even though it certainly wasn't. Not nearly as many people watch that one as, say, watch the Cuba documentary.
But that brings me to the phrase you would always say, and I'm not going to say it correctly, but many times you'll say, sometimes as journalists, we need to tell our audience what they should be aware of. We're not telling them what to think, but we need to let them know certain things are important. But what's the phrase you always say?
Well,
you know what I'm saying?
Yes, absolutely. Our job, I believe, as journalists, is to go out and find the things that are truly important and then come back and make them interesting. And too often we get it flipped around. We go out and we find things that are interesting and try to make them seem important. That's why I think of journalism as a profession. I mean, it is not my job to just give you what you want. It's my job, to a certain degree, to give you what I think you need, the information that I think is important to your life. And it is up to me and incumbent on me to package it and shape it in a way that does help you understand why it's so important. That's my job. And if I fail at that, then that's on me, but the consequences are grave. We are a world that has to rely on information that is accurate, transparent, and clear, and reliable. And we have suddenly, in this new digital world with all these ones and zeros flying around, and all this artificial intelligence, it's really difficult to discern what's true and what's not. I don't think that there are great things ahead for a society that loses the inability to find out what's true. That's going to be a problem.
Yeah, it is. You brought photo albums.
I have photo albums.
Are we going to look?
Sure.
Do you mind?
To.
Do you mind? That's a good tease. Part 2. He brought photo albums.